comes into place on the 1st of December. A lot of employment lawyers are scrambling to get their heads around this legislation, and I am learning constantly about fair pay agreements. So if anyone's got any comments about, hey, look, I don't think that's quite right, or I've heard this, please jump in. I'd love to hear your comments. All right, so this is our plan of attack today. I want to run through a bit of a background as to what's brought us here. I want to talk about what's going to be in a fair pay agreement. I want to run through an overview of the process as we understand it, as outlined in the legislation. Some challenges that we can already foresee, and I guess a little bit of what's next. So I guess before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page as to what a fair pay agreement is. And if you haven't quite got your head around that, I wouldn't stress too much, because I think what it looks like under the legislation is really different to how it was portrayed, how it was advertised or promoted by the government at the very beginning. So my understanding at the very beginning, before we had any legislation and this was all just conversational, my understanding was that this was going to be like the system in the awards system in Australia, essentially where you've got the government setting how much certain people in certain industries need to be paid. That is completely different to what we've ended up with. So a fair pay agreement is essentially collective bargaining for an industry as opposed to an employer. And I think the other thing we've got to get our head around here is that individual employment agreements and collective employment agreements, that they're not going to disappear. The three types of agreements, individual employment agreements, collective agreements, and fair pay agreements, are all going to have to live in unison together. So what fair pay agreements will do is they will set a bare minimum of terms and conditions for a particular industry. And then you might have collective employment agreements and individual employment agreements that provide for terms and conditions above that fair pay agreement. So I guess the thing that I need you to firstly get your head around is the fact that if you're an organisation that has a collective agreement, if you end up with a fair pay agreement, you might end up with three types of agreements in your workplace: collectives, individuals, and fair pay agreements. So as I have already touched on, the legislation has now passed and it comes into force on the 1st of December. My understanding is that there are unions preparing documentation to initiate a fair pay agreement, so they're ready to go on 1st of December. Unsurprisingly, this is being touted as the biggest change to employment law in some decades. I've practiced employment law for 15 years, and this is probably the biggest change, and we've had a lot of changes, but this is the biggest change I've probably seen in my time. And some of my other colleagues are saying, well, look, actually, this is as big as, if not bigger, than when the Employment Relations Act came in and the Employment Contracts Act was out the door. This has been an incredibly controversial law that has been introduced, and over 2,000 submissions were received during public consultation, which is incredibly rare to get that level of engagement through a selection committee process. Many of you will also be aware that Business New Zealand have refused to support this legislation, and that becomes a little bit clearer later on when I talk about employer bargaining parties. The other thing I guess I just wanted to bring to your attention is some of you might have seen the publicity about the concerns that this might go at odds with international labour law. So what that was about is international employment law is very clear that individuals should be able to bargain for their own terms and conditions. Business New Zealand and other parties' concerns, including political parties, the National Party were incredibly worried about this. They were saying that by having a fair pay agreement, it was taking away the rights of individuals to negotiate for their terms and conditions of employment. Um, Interestingly, the International Labour Organization disagreed with that, and they were of the view that it's setting minimum terms and conditions, and there is nothing stopping an individual to try and negotiate for more. So I have a quote here on this slide which outlines what Minister Wood has said about what the whole aim of fair pay agreements is. But I guess the big selling point, the main thing it's trying to achieve is it's trying to bring up the pay rates of certain industries in this country. Now, many have said it's wider than pay. We had our employment lawyers conference in Christchurch a couple of weeks ago, and as you can imagine, there was an incredibly heated discussion on this. And a lot of lawyers who act for unions were there, and they were saying it's bigger than pay. They were saying it's things like we want to bring back time and a half for evening work, we want to bring back time and a half for weekend work, etc. So although the primary objective is around people's base pay, I think we're going to see unions try and negotiate for some terms and conditions that have perhaps moved on from our workplaces. All right, so the next thing I want to touch on is what the guts of a fair pay agreement is. So let's keep in mind it's going to set the minimum terms and conditions for an industry. So if we reach an agreement on a fair pay agreement, and I'll come back shortly on what that process will look like, but the types of things that a fair pay agreement is supposed to include are things like not just base rates, but as I've already outlined, overtime and penalty rates, so penal rates, leave entitlements, and access to training and development opportunities. The expectation under a fair pay agreement is you can't contract out of our current legislation. So our Holidays Act provides for employers having 4 weeks annual leave a year. You can't in a fair pay agreement negotiate for people to have 3. The expectation is that a fair pay agreement is above the minimums of our current legislation. Interestingly, it's expected that fair pay agreements are supposed to have a timeline of 3 to 5 years. So I guess if you look at that in relation to wages, the parties are going to have to reach an agreement on what pay increases employees are going to receive over a number of years. That's challenging. A lot of my employer clients say, look, it's difficult to set pay rates for the next year. We don't know what our business is going to look like. To negotiate pay rates for 3, 4, 5 years must be incredibly challenging. And I guess as an extension of that, if the parties want to come back to the table during the term of the fair pay agreement, then there needs to be a process for what that's going to look like. So as I've already touched on, the introduction of fair pay agreements doesn't mean that collective agreements and individual employment agreements are out the window. They're going to live in unison. So once a fair pay agreement is passed into law, terms will automatically apply to any covered employee that meets the threshold test. So 25 or more of their work is covered under the coverage. However, if someone has negotiated a term under their individual employment agreement or collective agreement that's better than the FPA, the better term will apply. All right. So I guess what I want you to take away from this is a fair pay agreement cannot undercut an individual or a group of employees. It can only do better than. So as I said, an FPA is a minimum. It sets a floor on pay and conditions. The other tricky thing is that there is a high chance that there might be fair pay agreements that different fair pay agreements that apply to one employee. In that instance, the more generous fair pay agreement will apply. So I guess by way of an example, you might, if someone's a cleaner at a supermarket, there might be a fair pay agreement that applies to cleaners, and there might be a fair pay agreement that applies to those who work in supermarkets. That cleaner at the supermarket is entitled to the terms and conditions that are better. So whichever agreement is better for them, they are entitled to that. I'm going to see, I foresee that there are going to be scraps as to which agreement is better, i.e. one agreement might be better in relation to pay, but another agreement might be better in relation to holidays. What then? Your guess is as good as mine in relation to that. So what I want to do now, and I'm very, very conscious that I could talk about the process itself and gobble up the hour quite quickly. But I want to give you all a bit of an overview of the fair pay agreement process. Now, I think all lawyers, employment lawyers who act for employers and employees, I think lawyers who act for the unions were pretty gutted when this legislation came out. And the reason I say that is it's an incredibly large piece of legislation. There are approximately 250 sections to the legislation. And I think we were hoping that if this was going to go through, it was going to be a fairly simplistic piece of legislation, but it's not at all. It's incredibly complicated. So I do want to run you through a bit of a highlights reel in relation to it. And as I said, if there are things as I'm talking that you go, hang on, I don't think that's quite right, or I've heard something different, I'd really love you to make that comment, because we're all on a bit of a learning journey here. All right, so how can a fair pay agreement be initiated? So I've already talked about that some unions are already working on the paperwork, but there are a few ways they can be initiated. So 1,000 workers in an industry can all agree with the union that they want a fair pay agreement to go ahead, or 10% of the workforce can initiate a fair pay agreement. So probably in most areas, the 1,000 worker test is going to be easier than the 10%, not only from a numbers perspective, but I was having a discussion with an employment law recently, and it's not like we have a enrolment form for what industry people are in. So how do you know what's 10%? So I suggest more often than not, people or unions are going to try and meet the 1,000 worker test. The other way that it can be initiated is the Employment Relations Authority can initiate a fair pay agreement if they are of the view that a particular sector is not being looked after. I would suggest with the Employment Relations Authority's workload, that's going to be highly unlikely. And they're going to become even busier with these fair pay agreements, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I suggest looking at the tests. The main one that's going to try and be ticked off is this 1,000 worker test. Right, so this is where it gets pretty tough, and I guess this is one area that I don't 100% have my head around yet. And once again, I welcome any comments from people on this call. So the employees will be represented by a union or unions if they decide to work together on a fair pay agreement. A group of employers will be represented by an employer association. Now, what the government's original position under the legislation is that if no employers want to be involved, or alternatively, if every man and his dog wants to be involved, Business New Zealand will then step in and they will become the employer association. This is the point where Business New Zealand said, nah, we're not getting involved. So government sorted out. This is where the government made some amendments at the select committee stage, and the Act was updated to include a backstop. So essentially what will happen is the employer association at that point will become either one of two parties. One, there'll be a person will essentially will be, so sorry, it becomes a voluntary position. So essentially an employer association will put up their hand and say, hey, look, we'll run this. If no one does that, then at that point, the Employment Relations Authority will set the terms of the Fair Pay Agreement. So they will essentially act as the group of employers, and they will make a decision as to how everyone's going to be paid and what their terms and conditions are. So my gut feel is that I don't think the issue is going to be employers are not going to want to be involved. I think the problem we're going to have is that everyone's going to want to be involved. And I guess the example I want to give is I do a lot of work in hospitality, tourism, particularly hotels, and I'm sure hotels won't mind me using them as an example. But say if a fair pay agreement is initiated with hotel workers, I imagine all the big hotel chains and a number of smaller ones as well will want to be at that bargaining table. So Accor will want to be there, Intercontinental will want to be there, Sedema will want to be there, Jetpark will want to be there. So I'm struggling to understand how they're going to reach agreement as to who gets to speak on their behalf, how they're going to reach an agreement on terms for offers to be put forward to the union. So as I said, that's a bit that I don't quite have my head around, and if anyone's got any comments or ideas around that, that would be incredibly helpful. So how it will work? Well, essentially the process itself is actually not that dissimilar to collective bargaining for anyone on this webinar who's been involved in collective bargaining before. So parties must negotiate and attempt to come to an agreement, and then the terms will then go to a vote. So if the employer group and the union reach an agreement, the terms will then go to the employees to vote. If more than half of workers and more than half of employers votes, big employers will have more votes than smaller ones are cast in favour, then the deal is done. So you've got to have a majority of the employers and majority of the employees that agree. If negotiations reach a stalemate or a deal is rejected twice, then the authority will step in and they can make a decision about terms and conditions. So this is kind of, I guess, the scary part for, I think, everyone involved, including the Employment Relations Authority. So for those who've been through the personal grievance process before, the Employment Relations Authority, it's their job to make a decision about who's right and who's wrong in disputes. It's not normally their job to set terms and conditions for people's employment. Under this legislation, the Employment Relations Authority will be able to make that decision. How they're going to make that decision is incredibly concerning. This is not a piece of work that they've been involved with before, but under the legislation, that is the power that they have. Alrighty, so look, I think from what I've already been through, there's probably no doubt in your mind that there are some incredible challenges that we're going to face in relation to these fair pay agreements. And what I want to talk through now is, I guess, some of the problems that we foresee. And once again, there might be a few comments in the Q&A section where you foresee some other problems as well. So I guess one of the biggest issues I think we've got is that under the legislation, current government bodies, current government departments are expected to do a lot of work in relation to these fair pay agreements. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here when I say that they are incredibly under the pump at the moment. So how on earth are they going to fit in all of this as well? So at different stages of the fair pay agreement process, and look, as I said, I have given you a pretty high level overview. There's a lot more detail, but at different stages of the process, the Ministry of Business Innovation and Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, and the Employment Relations Authority, at different stages, they are expected to jump in. The ministry are expected to check all applications, that they are within rules and that they validate representatives. If negotiations are successful, MB still needs to approve the fair pay agreement and bring it into force through secondary legislation. They have been provided with additional funding, but bottlenecks are expected. Many of you will be dealing with bottlenecks through Immigration New Zealand at the moment, and I have no doubt that MB is not going to be any different. As I've spoken about, the Employment Relations Authority, it'll be their job to make decisions about these agreements, and they'll also be required to intervene in relation to disputes from time to time. Once again, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say they just don't have capacity for this. Between COVID, they have had departures and new people arrive. The backlog in the Employment Relations Authority is huge. From date of application to a hearing, you're looking at around a year's wait for a hearing at the moment. They are expected to provide their decisions within 3 months, but because of their workloads, many of those decisions are not coming within 3 months. A member of my team was involved in a hearing that was July last year. So what are we? We're coming up to 18 months ago. We still don't have a decision. And look, this is not me criticising the Employment Relations Authority, quite the opposite. But I just don't know how they are expected to manage this extra layer of work and this incredibly complex layer of work. Some of the challenges we see ahead. So I gave the example earlier of if we end up with 2 fair pay agreements. So I used the example of a supermarket cleaner. Are they covered by a supermarket fair pay agreement, or are they covered by a cleaner FPA? But to be honest, I see disputes around coverage arising even before a fair pay agreement is in existence. So if I use a pretty general example, if a fair pay agreement is initiated in relation to hospitality, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about bars and restaurants? Are we talking about cafe workers? Are we talking about those who work in hotel, restaurants and cafes? I think there are going to be some initial scraps about who an initiation applies to. As I've already touched on, this backstop position of the Employment Relations Authority is being an employer association is incredibly scary in my view. So employers really, if they disengage with the process, the Employment Relations Authority will be in charge of setting terms and conditions for their workforce. If a group of employers actually can't agree who's going to speak on their behalf, then once again, the Employment Relations Authority might become the backstop to be their decision maker. So this is pretty big and pretty scary stuff. The next thing I want to talk to you is around these notification requirements for unions. And look, this is not normally my style, but I just want to read this bit out because I think this is incredibly important and perhaps naively not an issue that I'd turned my mind to until this legislation came out. So what I'm getting to here is that you might be a workplace that's actually involved in a fair pay agreement, but you might not have any idea. So just to talk you through this, the initiating union was initially required under the legislation to identify and notify all other unions whose members it believed were likely to be covered by the Fair Pay Agreement and employers who it believed were likely to be covered by the Fair Pay Agreement. The Select Committee noted that this is likely to be a difficult and onerous task, so accordingly, the Act was changed so that the initiating union must use its best endeavours, so they've got to try really hard, to identify and notify other employers and unions. This heightens the risk of businesses and employees not even being aware that a fair pay agreement is being negotiated about them in the background. So I guess if I use a pretty silly example, the reality is if a fair pay agreement is initiated with those in the grocery industry, depending on how it's drafted, arguably that could apply to a supermarket in Queenstown, as well as a dairy in Kaitaia. Now, it is highly likely that a supermarket in Queenstown will know that a fair pay agreement is being negotiated in the background. Potentially, the dairy in Kaitaia might have no idea, but if it comes into force, it will apply to them. So these are just some of the logistical and practical issues that we are starting to turn our mind to. The other thing that I guess is a bit of a misconception and is something that I wanted to cover off with you. I've talked a lot about unions. And I think as a result of that, there's this misconception that if an individual isn't a member of the union, or if you're a workplace that doesn't have union involvement, then this won't apply to you. That's not the case at all. It's expected that unions will drive a lot of this work, and it's expected that unions will have members who want to be a part and engaged in this process. But if I use the supermarket example again, so a supermarket in Queenstown might have heaps of union members, but the dairy in Kaitaia, it's highly unlikely they have any union members. The fact that they've got no union members, the fact that they have employees who don't even want to be in the union, that's by the by. Unions will be able to start negotiating their terms and conditions. Now, to me personally, I think that's a little bit scary, particularly in a workplace that has collectives and has IEAs. People have already made a choice as to which agreements they want to be involved in. They've already made a choice that they don't want a union negotiating on their behalf. But under a fair pay agreement, tough luck. They might have a union negotiating for their minimum terms and conditions. And as I've already touched on, there's nothing stopping an individual then going to their boss and saying, hey, look, under the fair pay agreement, I'm going to get $26 an hour. I actually want 28. I think good luck to them once a fair pay agreement is set. But that's, I guess, just a bit of an issue that I wanted to make you live to and make you aware of. Alrighty, so how am I going for time? Cool, I'm doing pretty well here. All right, so look, there are a few final points that I guess I want to run past you all, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments at that point. So as for what's next, as I've outlined, what we've got now is a piece of legislation that is passed. It's coming into force on the 1st of December. Although it's a bulky piece of information, that is all the information that we've got at this stage. So because it's so new, we don't have any case law. My understanding is we don't have any MB guidelines or anything yet. So this is going to be a bit of a learning curve as we all work through this. So there's significant uncertainty, and I guess as a result of that uncertainty, what we're expecting is that people are going to challenge this from the outset. Um, when employers come to me with questions about fair pay agreements, often my answers at the moment is, well, the legislation says this, but we don't know how this is going to play out. So I think there is a lot here to be tested. I think one of the other questions, and this theme has come up a lot in my discussion, and that is, how on earth are employer groups going to coordinate themselves in relation to this? I guess it's akin to multi-employer collective bargaining, but we don't see that very often anymore. And fair pay agreements are multi-employer collective bargaining on steroids. So I know some employers who are in certain industries are starting to have conversations around, if a fair pay agreement is initiated with us, how do we want to attack it? Are we all going to get our own lawyers? Are we going to all use one lawyer? Who's going to be the spokesperson? What's our process going to be? I know some employers are starting to have those conversations in preparation, but it's going to be challenging. And I guess if I come back to the point of, well, what's the purpose of fair pay agreements? The primary purpose, and I don't care what anyone else says, but the primary purpose of them is to drive up wages. And what a lot of employers are saying to me is that they're struggling to keep up with the minimums that the government requires them to pay now. And any more than that is going to push them over the edge and sink them. So a lot of employers are saying, well, it's all well and good entering into these agreements, but they might create quite unsustainable outcomes for us. As I've already touched on, you've got to keep in mind here that just because you don't have union involvement in your workplace doesn't mean that you can steer clear of fair pay agreements. There's a chance you'll be dragged in whether you like it or not. There's been lots of rumours around which workforces are going to be brought in first. Since I drafted this seminar, I'd like to take out bus drivers and I'd like to include hospitality. Many of you would have seen in the news that bus drivers have been given a pay increase by the government. So as a result, I don't know if there's that bigger urgency to do fair pay agreements for bus drivers. There's more and more talk about hospitality. There's more and more talk about retail. But a lot of the industries that are being talked about are security officers, supermarket workers, cleaners, early childhood education workers as well. So once again, in the comments, if you're aware of a group or a union preparing paperwork to initiate for a particular group, I'd love to hear that. At the moment, it's all just hearsay, but the more information we can share in this forum, the better. And the note that I guess I want to leave you with, which will either provide you with some reassurance or scare you even more, is that the National Party have made it very clear that if they are in government after the election next year, whenever that is, it is likely that they will repeal fair pay agreements. We had a seminar at Lane Neave, Auckland, a few months ago now, where the Minister, or the Shadow Minister for Workplace Relations and Health and Safety, Paul Goldsmith, he came and spoke, and he made it very clear that they would scrap fair pay agreements straight away if they got in. I asked the question, if some fair pay agreements have already been agreed on before they get in, what will they do with those? He said they would scrap those as well. Now, I can't quite get my head around the mechanics of that. It's all well and good repealing the legislation, but to repeal fair pay agreements that already exist might be a little bit challenging, but they say that that's what they're going to do. As a result of that, and because National have been so vocal on this point, a lot of employers have said to me that it's their intention just to drag out the chain and prolong these processes in the hope that National do get in and repeal them and they don't have to deal with them. I'm not advocating for that, but I know it's definitely a strategy that some employers are starting to turn their mind to. What I will add to that is, as I've talked about through this presentation, the buck stops with the Employment Relations Authority. So there's nothing stopping the union making an application to the Employment Relations Authority to make a decision in the absence of an agreement. Because of the backlog in the Employment Relations Authority, I don't know if that would be heard before or after the election. But my understanding is the Employment Relations Authority have been advised to make fair pay agreement matters a priority. But once again, I don't know the logistics around that. Maybe I say this because I'm a little bit biased as an employment lawyer and I always listen out for this stuff. But look, my pick is that fair pay agreements and actually employment law generally is going to be a little bit of a hot topic in the next legislation. And it will be really interesting when National are required to provide a little bit more detail as to what they're actually going to do, not only with the current fair pay agreement legislation, but perhaps any fair pay agreements that have managed to have been negotiated during that time. Alrighty. I have nailed the timing. I did promise that I would provide 20 minutes for questions. And you can look at our ugly mugs while we have those questions. But if you like, Fiona, you can jump back on and perhaps run through those questions with me.
Thank you so much, Fiona. There's a lot to unpack there. If you've got questions, please put those into the Q&A. Look, first question from me is, how will businesses know if they're covered by a fair pay agreement once we kick off?
Yeah, so the expectation is that they will be issued a notice from the union or the group who's organising this initiation to say, hey, look, we're going to try and form a fair pay agreement with your workers. This is what we're proposing for the process. As I touched on very briefly, the expectation was under the first draft of the legislation was that a notice was to be provided to all employers who were going to be involved in the process. That's been watered down, and now the union or the group who are running this are expected to make best endeavours, or try really hard, as I like to say, to let employers know. And that's one of these scary areas for me. There is a chance, I think, that employers are not going to know that there is negotiation happening around them in relation to their workers.
And then I guess on that, what happens if a business doesn't want to be part of a fair pay agreement?
Yeah, so essentially, if you're covered under the coverage clause, and you have employees who are covered under that coverage clause, you actually can't get out of it. So the analogy, Fiona, that I use is it becomes like a new legal minimum wage, right? So if we use the grocery workers example, if a fair pay agreement outlines that all people who work in a grocery store have to be paid $28 an hour, that becomes the new minimum wage, whether or not you're a supermarket in Queenstown or a dairy in Kaitaia. So there's no opt-out mechanism. The only way to opt out is if you can show that your employees aren't covered under the coverage. And I think that's going to be, to be honest with you, some of the initial rows on this issue.
Yeah, we've got a question here. What yardstick would be used to set minimum pay, and how would the ERA determine this if they are in the position where backstop is required? Isn't minimum pay already set by the minimum wage, and what impact would fair pay agreements have on the minimum wage? Could it exert upward pressure?
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple of things to touch on there. The first one is a really good point. How on earth are authority members qualified? How are they supposed to make a decision about what people should be paid? They might look at data, they might look at international data, they might look at norms, but they're not going to be looking at your actual business and what you can afford. They're going to be looking at data, I presume. So as we talk right now, there are no tools as to how they're supposed to measure. They've just got the right to pick a pay rate. Um, and how that relates with the minimum wage is essentially that, as I said before, that will become the new minimum wage for your industry. So to a degree, what the legal minimum wage is for your industry might go out the window if there's a fair pay agreement that sets a new minimum. And this is one of the scary parts for me because, well, there are many scary parts, but one of them is I just don't know, and this is no criticism of the Employment Relations Authority, it's their job to determine disputes. How are they now going to make a decision as to what cleaners should be paid, what bus drivers should be paid, etc.? I think it's well beyond what they are expected to do.
Yeah, yeah. If a business is covered by a fair pay agreement, what do they need to do?
Yeah, so I guess there are two stages to that. The one is, I guess, the negotiation phase for the fair pay agreement. And the second is once an agreement or once the Employment Relations Authority has made a decision. In relation to step one, the negotiation, it really is up to you as an employer as to how you want to engage. You might sit back and say, look, I'll just see where this lies, and if there ends up being an agreement, then I will comply with that, or I might not comply with that. That's also an option open to you. But how engaged you are in that process is really up to you. But as I've touched on, if no one engages in that process, and when I say no one, if no employers engage in that process, or if too many employers engage in that process, then you risk the Employment Relations Authority making a decision about how you are supposed to pay and your terms and conditions of your employees. Once a fair pay agreement is agreed, your legal obligation is to comply with that. So if there's an agreement under the fair pay agreement that all employees will be paid $27 an hour and they will get time and a half for working on evenings and weekends, that becomes the new law that applies to your workplace, and you are legally required to pay that.
Could fair pay agreement bargaining lead to potential strike action if they can't come to agreements?
That's a really good question, and the answer is no. So the default position is that, so to take a step back, what often happens is if parties can't reach an agreement during collective bargaining, then parties can strike, etc. That's not one of the rules under the fair pay agreements. The default position is if you can't reach an agreement, then the Employment Relations Authority decides. But that's a really good question. And as this was being developed, we did wonder if this was something that would come in, but no, that's essentially been ruled out.
Great. We've got another question here. Could you please explain how it might work if we have people, this is from someone who works in a hotel, if we have people in a hotel that work in different departments that might be covered under different fair pay agreements? How does that work, Fiona?
Yeah, and that's something this is going to happen, I think, as more fair pay agreements come in. And it's just like the example I gave of the cleaner who works in the supermarket. If you've got a supermarket fair pay agreement and you've got a cleaner's fair pay agreement, which one are they entitled to? So in short, they are entitled to the one that's most favourable, that gets them the most. But as I touched on, what's a little bit confusing is how do you say which one's better, right? So you might have the cleaners fair pay agreement, which has a better base rate, but you might have a supermarket workers fair pay agreement that perhaps has more annual leave, as an example. So to some people, the higher base rate might be better. To some, the more holiday pay might be better. So in that situation, do you let the employee choose which one they want to be covered by? Does the employer choose? That's the bit we haven't quite got our head around.
Right. What penalties can be applied if a business doesn't abide by fair pay agreement requirements?
Yeah, and it depends a lot on what breach there is. So we'll use an example. Right now, if an employee is not paid minimum wage, then employees will be entitled to the difference of what they haven't been paid, and penalties might be paid. The employer might be required to pay penalties, etc. So as we talk right now, the same will be for pay under fair pay agreements. So if a fair pay agreement says you've got to pay your cleaners $30 an hour, but you're paying them $25, you'll be liable for the difference for up to 6 years, just like you are in any wage dispute right now. Other breaches to the fair pay agreement we haven't quite got our heads around, so it is going to be quite fact dependent on the breach.
Yeah, great. Oh, we've got another question here. All right, I'll just here. If a union like the New Zealand Nurses Organisation is already in the process of negotiating a new multi-employer collective agreement, would it be likely that come December the fair pay agreement, would it be likely that come December the fair pay agreement process will start? How does that work if there's already?
Really depends on, they might go, hey, look, we're really happy with where we've landed in relation to our MECA, so we might not pursue a fair pay agreement at this stage. Or they might go, actually, we're really happy with that, but let's see if we can get more. Or they might go, we're really grumpy with how that bargaining played out, so now we're going to go a fair pay agreement. So it's really difficult to, I guess, assess at what different unions will do. But as I said, it's many unions have made it clear that they're working on the paperwork now, ready to go 1 December.
Right. We've just had a question here. Is there any situation where an employer or employee can opt out of the fair pay agreements? And I think you've said there isn't.
No, there isn't. And in relation to employees, this comes back to this whole dispute around whether or not fair pay agreements whether they're contradictory to international labour law and are requiring individuals to be part of agreement which they don't want to be a part of. And the International Labour Organisation's position clearly was, it's just setting a minimum and people can try and get more than that if they want.
Right. If every component of a fair pay agreement is weighted, i.e. leave values, penalty values, when 2 different collectors cover 1 employee, would this work better as a mechanism to differentiate the better fair pay agreement?
Yes, potentially. And look, that's a really tricky technical question, and I'm really happy for that person to contact me offline so we can thrash that out a little bit more. At a high level, yes, fair pay agreements might be used as a tool to get around that. But yeah, I would probably like to have a bit of an offline chat in relation to that, because it's a bit tricky, probably, that one.
Yeah, and I guess Fiona, it's really tricky, and there is a lot to unpack. Is there any support available for employers who are trying to get their head around this?
Yeah,
Where do they start?
Yeah, so look, there's lots of information starting to appear online. So I guess the more reading you can do, the better. The fact that you're on this webinar today is a really good start as well. The government MB, I am expecting, will be providing more and more fact sheets and information as this progresses. The other thing you need to be aware of is that the government has already said that there will be, for the first few lots of fair pay agreements that are initiated, employers can get some financial assistance to get legal advice on these agreements. So there are mechanisms for that as well. I would suggest that whatever they're offering is probably not going to be enough to cover the complexities of these agreements. But the government has made that offer of financial assistance for legal support.
Right, thanks, Fiona. Do we have any more questions? Oh, great. Well, look, thank you so much, Fiona, for a really informative webinar. We really appreciate your time. Fiona will also be joining us in person. Oh, sorry, we've got one more question, actually. Could an employer be penalised for breaching one of the fair pay agreements if there's another fair pay agreement which is chosen on the basis that it's more favourable?
As we talk right now, yes. But I think that's going to be one of those areas that's going to be fleshed out in case law in time. But based on the information we've got, yes, that is possible.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. As I mentioned, Fiona's actually going to be here in Queenstown for Chamber members to see her in person, where she's going to be running an in-person employment law seminar. So we're looking forward to that, and we'll be promoting that across the Queenstown Chamber website and our newsletter and our social pages, so more details to come. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Fiona. We really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.